It is the most elusive treasure of them all, the cup of Christ, used at the Last Supper and imbued with miraculous powers.
It was really the answer to whatever it is you need, the ultimate balm, the ultimate healing thing, the solution to one's problems.
The Holy Grail has bewitched treasure hunters for over a millennium. And Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, would become obsessed with finding it.
Don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. What he wants, he gets.
He scoured the world in his search and was said to have sent special forces on top-secret missions.
Who better to send on your Grail quest than Otto Skorzeny, the ultimate one-man Nazi fighting machine?
And he placed the resources of the SS in the hands of Germany's foremost Grail hunter.
Otto Rahn was really the real Indiana Jones,
who would eventually give his life in the ultimate Nazi treasure hunt. This is the story of Himmler's quest for the Holy Grail. Berlin, 1933. The Nazis are in full control of Germany. Otto Rahn, a young cash-strapped writer, is heading to a meeting. He is answering a mysterious telegram. An anonymous benefactor has offered Rahn 1,000 Reichmarks a month, a very impressive wage, to write a book. The meeting is at 7 Prince Albertstrasse. Rahn has no idea who will be waiting for him.
He goes there, and who should he see but Heinrich Himmler himself.
Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, second only to Adolf Hitler. Himmler was the head of the SS, a fearsome paramilitary organization which controlled much of the Nazi state. He charged Rahn with a remarkable, almost unbelievable mission: to find the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is the most sought-after treasure in history.
The Holy Grail is the cup of the Last Supper, the cup of Christ, that is meant to have been used to celebrate the First Communion.
It is commonly believed that the same cup was used by the disciple, Joseph of Arimathea, to catch the blood of Christ whilst he was nailed to the cross. But other legends say it is even older than that the Grail was used by Abraham, the founding patriarch of the Jewish people.
There are other people, of course, who think that it's the cup of Abraham. And this cup apparently became part of the sacred treasure of the Jews and was carried around with the Ark of the Covenant.
Over the years, the legend of the Grail has grown and been embellished. Sometimes it is said to be a stone or a plate, but most commonly, it is a chalice. Whatever it is, all the legends agree that the Grail possesses miraculous powers. For the Grail is supposed to provide its holder with eternal life.
Grail is really the answer to whatever it is you need, the thing that will fill you up when you're empty, that will heal you when you're wounded. It's kind of the ultimate balm, the ultimate healing thing, the solution to one's problems.
Such is its mystique. The Grail has obsessed treasure hunters for centuries. Tales abound of crusader knights searching for it, whilst they laid waste to lands in the Middle East. And in legend, many of the stories of the mythical King Arthur and his knights concern their quest for the Grail. But despite thousands of years of searching, no one has ever found it. But why would Himmler want such an item? Not only was he a fanatical Nazi, it seems he held some other very unusual beliefs. He was obsessed with mystery, legend, astrology, the occult, and Germany's pagan past.
Himmler fundamentally was, today we would call him a geek. He was the type of guy who was massively into Tolkien. He'd be playing Warhammer every day. He was just a nerd, if you like. I mean, there's no other word to describe him.
Well, Heinrich Himmler was obviously an extremely strange man, but he was in a position of extraordinary power.
Don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. What he wants, he gets.
Himmler shaped his SS on the traditions of Germany's pre-Christian tribes. He promoted a cult of ancestor worship, and within the SS, Christian festivals would be replaced with pagan holidays. Instead of Christmas and Easter, Himmler had his SS celebrate the winter and spring solstices. Officers were married in SS rituals called Ehrweihe. SS naming ceremonies replaced christenings. It was as if he were attempting to create a new Nazi religion.
By reawakening the old gods and the ancient traditions of their Germanic ancestors, they hoped to create a new order that would dominate Europe for the next 1,000 years.
Even the design of the SS insignia reflected Himmler's obsession with Germany's pagan past. It was two Sieg runes, occult symbols of a long-dead Germanic people.
You've got this creation of a kind of whole mythology which starts to become a real, quote-unquote, religion. You've got all these sort of elements that the Nazis want to include, and if you're trying to create a religion, if you want to look how to do it, well, you should just study Himmler and what he got up to, because in many ways, he was the perfect kind of cult leader. And that's what Nazism became, and that's what the religion behind Nazism became. It was basically a cult.
Himmler's obsession with mysticism led him to focus on one of the greatest legends of all: the legend of the Holy Grail. He selected for his headquarters Wewelsburg Castle in northeast Germany. He installed a round table and a ritual chamber in the basement of the north-facing tower. He named rooms after King Arthur and the Holy Grail. This was to be Himmler's Camelot, a castle for his new knightly order.
He wanted the SS to be a kind of breed of Teutonic knights. And he wanted to blend Arthurian myth with actual present-day, real, mechanized military machine. He wanted to have those same sort of knightly virtues that you read about in Grail legends.
Now he had his castle and his knights. There was one last thing he needed.
Now, what better to have in your knightly Arthurian-style castle than the Grail itself?
And that was why Rahn had been summoned to meet Himmler. Because Rahn was Germany's leading expert on the Holy Grail. Otto Rahn was born in 1904. He grew up during the horrors of the First World War. As an escape, he immersed himself in legends and mythology.
He was enamored by all the myths and legends of the old days, because the present was not so nice. So that he fled back in books and stories, and the stories of Wodan and Donor and all the Nordic stories.
His favorite myth, very popular in Germany, was about one of King Arthur's knights of the Round Table, Percival, known in Germany as Parsifal. The best-known version of the story was written by Wolfgang von Eschenbach in the 13th century. In the tale, a young Parsifal searches for the elusive Grail. In Eschenbach's version, the Grail is not a cup, but a rock.
The Grail is described as a hard, dark stone, which is contained in a reliquary. And Eschenbach says whoever has this stone or is near to it will have eternal life and will be healed.
According to the legend, Parsifal eventually finds the Grail in a mythical castle which Eschenbach calls Munsalbesch.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Rahn became captivated with the tale, believing that Munsalbesch was a real place and that the Parsifal story was actually true. He was convinced that by studying it, he could find the castle. And if he could find Munsalbesch, then he would find the Grail. The young Rahn threw himself into researching these myths.
I think Otto became enthused with the idea of actually finding the truth behind these legends. Also, he had a very methodical German mind. He was trying to really back-engineer the myth by finding the historical personages that became the figures in mythology. We can see in his work that there's maps and genealogies.
After years of researching, Rahn eventually discovered a clue. He found it in the songs of the troubadours, the traveling poets of the medieval courts of France.
Otto Rahn rightly decided that the troubadour songs were really the only authentic record of what had happened. That a lot of the written records had been destroyed, but through oral tradition, through the songs and through the legends, echoes of what had really come down still survived into the present day.
In some of these songs, the troubadours sang of a medieval religious sect called the Cathars. The Cathars were said to have owned great treasures, including a sacred relic, a rock that had fallen from heaven. Rahn was sure that this relic must be the Holy Grail, as described by Eschenbach. The Cathars certainly were real. They were a 12th century religious sect, predominantly from the Languedoc region of southwest France.
What we call Catharism is really a variant of Christianity which believed that you needed no intermediaries between man and God, that any individual could have direct communion with the divine, which meant that the entire hierarchy of priests, prelates, cardinals, the entire church was kind of irrelevant, which also bugged Catholicism no end.
The Pope branded the Cathars heretics, and a vicious crusade was launched against them.
And this religious group of people were hunted down by the Roman Catholic Church because they opposed the Roman Catholic Church.
Across southern France, the Cathars were slaughtered in their thousands by the forces of the Pope. The last remaining Cathars were besieged in a mountain fortress called Montségur.
Montségur was the place where the Cathars held their last stand in 1244. This is when the armies surrounded the castle for 10 months.
Eventually, the odds were just too much for them, 10,000 against approximately 300 fighting men. After a 16-day truce, the surviving Cathars under their last priest, Bertrand Marty, were chained by the hands and the neck and dragged down the mountain at dawn, hanging them, cutting their throats as a way of destroying the faith once and for all.
And finally, after they surrendered, 200 Cathars were burned at the stake. So it is gone into history as the last stand of the Cathars.
All of this was verifiable fact. But if, as Rahn believed, the stories of the troubadours were also true, what had happened to the Cathar treasure and the Holy Grail?
When the Crusaders entered the castle, there was no trace of the mythical treasure, the infinite amounts of money they had expected. And over the years, various legends and rumors have accrued around what actually happened to the treasure of the Cathars, the treasures of the faith.
Rahn uncovered local stories which said that the Cathars had managed to smuggle their treasure out of the castle before it fell.
There was a very enduring story, a myth perhaps, that there were 4 of the Cathars who were hidden in the castle against the terms of the ceasefire, who apparently escaped the night before the burning, carrying with them the legendary Holy Grail. People started to believe that it had been smuggled out.
The escaping Cathars, according to this legend, then hid the Grail somewhere in the network of caves and caverns which run for miles throughout the mountains. Rahn became convinced that the legend was true and that the Grail had to be hidden at Montségur.
I can see Rahn's thinking in that he thought that these really were the places described in the original myth. And he was certainly very, very enthused and excited by what he had found.
Otto was quite sure that he had to find the Grail here, that this must have been the place where they hid it.
Even before being summoned by Himmler, Rahn had traveled to Montségur, a beautiful, remote area of the French Pyrenees. He was sure that the Grail could be found in the uncharted mountains of this region. He spent years exploring the area.
All these places were completely off the map at that point. No one knew about this history or about the existence of the caves or the castles.
The work was difficult and treacherous, but undeterred, Rahn sunk more and more of his money into the quest.
Where he took over the lease on a small hotel, which was really a front for his continued explorations of the area. He started to really methodically work his way through all the cave systems. Certainly had his work cut out. It's the largest limestone district in Europe. And he wasn't a trained archaeologist. In fact, he was a trained etymologist. But he certainly got his hands dirty.
Otto Rahn was really the real Indiana Jones. He was out there. He was into the woods, he was climbing caves, he was climbing castles, he was searching for relics and searching for treasure.
Eventually, he had a breakthrough. Deep in the caves, he found childlike engravings, which he copied in his notebook. In a cavern known as the Bethlehem Grotto, he discovered a strange pentagonal depression carved into the wall. He believed that Cathars once stood in the pentagram when they were being initiated into the order. Rahn also uncovered human skeletons in the caves, which he believed were Cathar remains. To Rahn, this was solid evidence that the Cathars had brought the Grail here. If he could only explore deeper into the caves, Rahn was sure that he would eventually find it. But after years of expensive explorations, Rahn ran out of money.
Otto left France under something of a cloud. He was unable to make the payments on the hotel he'd taken over, and he hadn't been able to pay his staff, and there were in fact legal proceedings against him.
When he returned to Germany, all he had to show for his efforts were notes for a book. But unknown to Rahn, a copy of his book would fall into the hands of the one man in Germany who had both the resources and the will to relaunch his expedition: Heinrich Himmler.
Before the Nazis came to power, people like Otto Rahn were, these kind of weedy, inconsequential figures. They're obsessed with finding the Holy Grail. This was something no one really took seriously. But then suddenly you get this whole new regime that takes these things extremely seriously.
Rahn had never shown any interest in the politics of the Nazis. But now Heinrich Himmler would provide a solution to the biggest problem he faced in his quest for the Grail. Because he offered Rahn the one thing he needed: money.
He was told that the SS would take over funding his research, that they'd give him all the money he needed to continue his search. The only catch being you'd have to wear a black uniform and report to his superiors.
Rahn now found himself in the SS, an organization recruited from the Aryan elite of Nazi Germany. Its members were required to prove their ethnic purity and trace their German bloodline often as far back as the 18th century. It ran some of the most intimidating branches of the Nazi state, including concentration camps and the secret police. Despite this, Rahn seemed to have no concerns about joining.
When you don't have any money and somebody offers you 1,000 Reichsmark a month, and the only thing you have to do that is to join the SS. And you could have a carte blanche, you could go anywhere in Europe and do your hobby. Otto's hobby was to research. So he said, yeah, I'll take the money, I'll go find, treasures and stuff. Why not?
In 1936, on Himmler's orders, Unterscharführer Rahn joined one of the strangest and most unusual outfits in the SS, a unit entirely staffed by academics. It was called the Ahnenerbe.
If you want the classic example of how the Nazis manipulated intellectualism and academic behavior, you can go no further than look at the Ahnenerbe. This was an institution set up ultimately by Himmler to research, quote unquote, German ancestry. And it was to look at how you could construct a mythology of Aryanism and Germanic culture.
Himmler believed the Germans were a master race, set aside from all others by their nobility and purity. The Ahnenerbe's task was to provide intellectual proof for this claim.
The Ahnenerbe is very much Himmler's baby. These are his academics, these are his scientists, these are his historians, these are his archaeologists, and they're there ultimately to do one thing, to prove that Himmler's right. Unfortunately, he's completely wrong.
As an academic, joining the Ahnenerbe was the equivalent of selling your soul, because to be a member, you would be asked to prove things that were not true. For example, Himmler even wanted the Ahnenerbe to prove that Jesus was not Jewish.
They were creating their own Bible, an Aryan Bible, a Bible in which Jesus was an Aryan.
The Ahnenerbe claimed that Jesus was part of a tribal group which was not Semitic, but Aryan.
Difficult to believe that you could take Judaism out of the Bible, but that's what the Nazis were doing, and they literally did it. They created an Aryan Bible.
Although it might seem ridiculous, the work of the Ahnenerbe was not harmless.
One's got to be very, very careful not just to write off the Ahnenerbe as a bunch of harmless cranks. No, these people are willingly subverting their own knowledge, their own academic excellence in order to prove something that will later be used to murder people.
But for the moment, Rahn turned a blind eye. In return, he got lavishly funded in his quest for the Grail. With Himmler's backing, Rahn threw himself into his research with renewed vigor and soon published a second book, Lucifer's Court. It was based on new research and on his earlier explorations of the caves around Montségur, where he was convinced the Cathars had hidden the Grail. Himmler was impressed with Rahn's progress. On Reichsführer's order, 5,000 copies of Rahn's book were bound in the finest leather and distributed to the Nazi elite.
Otto's books, first Crusade Against the Grail and his sequel, Court of Lucifer, rapidly became compulsory reading at a certain level of promotion within the SS. If you rose above a certain rank, you were required to read Rahn, and I bet a lot of people really cursed at the idea of having to plow through that material.
With Himmler's backing, Rahn swiftly rose through the ranks of the SS, even though he was not typical SS material.
He was a scholar, an academic, a writer, a poet, and not a warrior. He was a terrible soldier. He was not a great physical specimen. He smoked too much. He was very he wasn't very useful on the exercise ground. He was very poor with a gun. He was still promoted very rapidly and ended up as an Obergruppenführer.
But his new power and riches came at a terrible cost to his integrity. Reading proofs of his new book, Rahn discovered that someone had inserted anti-Semitic passages. Rahn chose to ignore this. Still, his only interest was in finding the Grail.
It was a devil's deal, and I think he was perhaps too quick to pick up on.
Himmler would now send Rahn all over Europe to find the Grail.
Rahn is dispatched to any number of locations. There's a lot of letters from the time where Otto is asking permission to visit various sites and excavate various sites, and it's just literally lists of place names.
He visited Europe's most famous pagan sites. He conducted excavations and visited pre-Christian monuments around the continent, including the Exensteiner, a towering rock formation in northwestern Germany where ancient Germanic tribes had worshipped for centuries. Himmler even dispatched Rahn as far as Iceland, at the head of an SS expedition searching for the Grail. But despite a worldwide quest lasting over 2 years, Rahn couldn't find it.
The fact that he couldn't find the physical Grail made him very nervous, because he couldn't really please Himmler the way he wanted to please him.
Little by little, Rahn began to lose Himmler's confidence.
There's an increasing desperation in the way that Otto attempted to safeguard his position. He was desperate to try and come up with some kind of material evidence for Himmler, to try and show that he was actually of value to the Nazi party after all.
And when Rahn returned from one of his trips, he began to see the SS for what it really was. A terrifying force that oppressed and brutalized its victims.
Really, it became a kind of a state within a state, almost like a parallel form of the police force of the army.
Otto was away a lot, so he didn't really see it much. And when he did come home in Germany, he noticed the change, he noticed the difference.
Suddenly it had become clear to Rahn the danger he was in for failing to find the Grail.
I think he realized his days were numbered.
He started to drink, he started to smoke.
a general sense of panic seems to have set in. Things began to fall apart.
Rahn desperately hoped that Heinrich Himmler would give him more time. But Himmler had run out of patience. In 1937, Himmler stripped Rahn of his rank. Rahn was sent to act as a guard at the notorious Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps. The concentration camps were built by the Nazis to imprison political and social undesirables. At that time, inmates in Buchenwald included socialists, communists, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, who were herded into inhuman conditions.
He saw people being hurt, beaten up, murdered. He wanted to get out of there quick. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He wanted to flee. He wanted to go somewhere else, live somewhere else. He asked several times to live here in France, but it was denied. He didn't really want to be part of the Germany that it had become.
He wrote to a friend,
"I have much sorrow in my country. Impossible for a tolerant, liberal man like me to live in a nation that my native country has become."
He was scared out of his senses.
there was a particular reason that what Rahn had seen at Buchenwald filled him with terror. Because he was hiding a dangerous secret. He was himself homosexual.
He had covered this up from the SS from the very beginning because obviously homosexuality, just like being Jewish, was something which would get one sent to the camps. Certainly a lot of people died for the same reasons.
And there was something even worse. Rahn wasn't a pure-blooded Aryan. He was Jewish.
He had Jewish roots through his mother, Clara, and which succeeded in covering up for quite a long period of time.
As a member of the SS, Rahn was required to prove he was of pure Aryan descent. It was something he had been deliberately avoiding.
There's also the matter of his Ahnenpass, the certificate of racial purity that he was meant to fill out, which he never submitted.
An Ahnenpass needed to show 4 generations of a pure German bloodline. For Rahn to have submitted his would have been tantamount to suicide. He had hoped that if he could find the Grail, then no one would be concerned about his Ahnenpass. But he had failed to find it. And in 1939, his luck finally ran out.
People found out that his parents, especially his mother, was Jewish. And it was obvious that he was gay. There were so many people saying it, proving it to his superiors.
A gay Jewish SS officer could not survive long in Nazi Germany. Coupled with his failure to find the Grail, Rahn's options were narrowing.
Plainly, Otto's position within the SS became untenable. He must have realized that it was suicidal to stay.
In March 1939, Rahn traveled to the German-Austrian border. High in the snow-covered Alps, he headed out into the mountains. Here, winter temperatures sit well below freezing. Rahn took with him only a bottle of whiskey and some sleeping pills.
It is interesting that it was very close to the 16th of March, to the anniversary of the fall of the Chateau of Montsegur and the burning of the Cathar martyrs. Maybe he chose that date deliberately.
I think he chose the Endura, the death of the Cathars, to sit in the forest, in the middle of the forest on a mountain slope with a magnificent view. Took a couple of bottles of sleeping tablets, knowing that he wouldn't wake up because he would freeze to death that night.
A notice in a Nazi newspaper reported it as a tragic death of an outstanding SS officer and scientist. In 1939, Europe descended into war. Himmler's SS were in the thick of the fighting. But even so, the Reichsfuhrer continued his search for the Grail throughout the war.
Yeah, one might readily have assumed that the death of their Parsifal, their lead Grail hunter, might have closed down the whole program. But this wasn't entirely the end of Himmler's interest in the occult and the archaeological oddities of the past.
In 1940, Himmler accompanied Hitler on a mission to Barcelona to convince Spanish dictator General Franco to bring Spain into the war. But Himmler had an ulterior motive for traveling with the Führer to Spain. He had a new lead for the Grail. It took Himmler to Montserrat Abbey in the Pyrenean Mountains, an hour from Barcelona. An abbey built on the foundations of an ancient castle. The SS had uncovered an age-old Catalonian folk song about a Grail-like mystical font of life at that castle. Himmler now believed that the Grail castle might not be Montségur in France, but instead Montserrat in Spain. Himmler ordered that the sole German-speaking monk at the abbey, Andrew Ripple Noble, should help him with the quest. But if the monk knew anything, he decided against telling Himmler, and the Reichsfuhrer left Spain empty-handed. However, it seems that Himmler's quest did not end there. The next stage of the story would be taken up by an American author, Howard Buchner, in 1991. As a young man in 1945, Buchner was part of the American advance through Europe. Like Rahn, he would become fascinated with the legend of the Grail.
Colonel Howard Buchner had been a surgeon with the American Army 3rd Battalion and was allegedly the first Allied doctor to enter Dachau.
There, he supposedly uncovered information from a captured SS officer, which he included in his book about the Nazi quest for the Grail.
Buchner wrote a book called Emerald Cup, a very curious book.
According to Buchner's sources, now that Himmler had ruled out Spain, he once again focused his attentions on the French Pyrenees. But this time, he decided on a radically different approach. Frustrated with the efforts of academics such as Rahn, Himmler now called upon one of the Reich's greatest military heroes to take up the quest, Otto Skorzeny.
He's a bear of a man. He's very tall, he's very charming, he's very imposing, he's got a dueling scar down one of his cheeks, and in many ways he's a pretty unreconstructed Nazi.
Skorzeny was the chief of Germany's special troops, the most famous and feared commando in the German army. Bold, fearless, and a hero to the Nazi faithful.
Buchner claims that Himmler had dispatched none other than Otto Skorzeny, the famous paratrooper and commando, allegedly the most dangerous man in the world, to retrieve the sacred treasure.
Himmler's tried the academics, he's tried the boffins. Why don't we send Otto Skorzeny?
Skorzeny was more than qualified for the task. In September 1943, he had led a daring raid on a prison in the Italian Alps to free the captured Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini. Dropping in by glider with a squadron of elite German commandos, they came under heavy fire. But Skorzeny would ensure the mission's success and his own glory by returning with Mussolini alive.
He's, in many ways, represents kind of the ultimate one-man Nazi fighting machine. Now, who better to send on your Grail quest, supposedly, than Otto Skorzeny?
So, according to Buchner, in March 1944, Himmler charged Skorzeny with yet another top-secret mission. But this time, to the castle of Montségur in France to find the Grail. Skorzeny decided to look again at Rahn's theory that the Grail had been taken out of the castle 700 years before by escaping Cathars.
Colonel Howard Buchner believed that Otto Skorzeny was able to look at the chateau with a military mind and imagine how such a feat might be possible.
Until now, nobody could understand how the Cathars could have escaped. 3 sides of the castle were besieged by thousands of soldiers, and the remaining side backed onto an impassable precipice. But by studying this cliff, Skorzeny had a revelation.
One side of the castle is this sheer cliff, and obviously everyone thinks, well, the Grail can't be hidden there because that's impossible. There's no way they could have done that. But Skorzeny, because he's this supposed tactical military genius, is the first person to say, but what if it is hidden there?
Skorzeny worked out that by using ropes, the escaping Cathars could have lowered themselves unseen over the castle walls and down the cliff face. If he was right, everyone else had been looking on the wrong side of the mountain.
Skorzeny quickly assumed that the Cathars would have taken the least likely route out of the castle and escaped down the sheer side of the cliff. And according to Buchner, he swiftly picked up their trail from the base of the cliff.
Six days after Skorzeny was said to have arrived at Montségur, it was the anniversary of the Cathar massacre.
March the 16th, 1944 was the 700th anniversary of the fall of the chateau.
A small group of local people chose to mark the occasion with a simple ceremony at the base of the castle. Then, something unexpected happened.
The story has it that while they were getting together on the mountain, that a German aircraft flew overhead.
It's the 700th anniversary of the massacre of the Cathars, and the plane makes a cross, a Cathar cross, in the sky.
Howard Buchner claims that this was a sign from Himmler that Skorzeny had been successful in his mission in recovering the Emerald Cup.
But could this be true? had Skorzeny really succeeded where everyone else had failed and found the Grail? Buchner's story is certainly entertaining, but there is one fundamental problem with his account. And that concerns Otto Skorzeny.
Whenever you hear the name Otto Skorzeny mentioned in connection with any fantastical story, to me that's a really important signifier that the story is almost certainly going to be an absolute pile of rubbish.
Although Skorzeny was a real person, captured by the Allies at the end of the war, he could not have led this mission.
By linking Skorzeny's alleged retrieval of the Holy Grail to the 700th anniversary of the fall of the castle, it means that he would have to have been here on the 16th of March, 1944.
But the Allies have proof that Otto Skorzeny was not in France in March 1944. He was in Yugoslavia, where the Germans were involved in vicious fighting.
Now, the truth is, when he was supposed to have been supposedly finding the Holy Grail in France, he was in fact, somewhere near the Eastern Front.
Buchner's story gets even wilder, with the Grail being taken by Nazi U-boat to Antarctica, where it is placed in a cave of ice in a secret Nazi base in the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains.
I mean, all of it makes for a wonderful story, and certainly after the Indiana Jones movies, we love the idea of uniformed Nazi stormtroopers ransacking the castles of the Pyrenees.
I mean, this is fun, but it's just not true.
But even though Buchner's story is just fantasy, the story of the Nazi hunt for the Grail is not. Heinrich Himmler was obsessed with mysticism, and he did fund expensive expeditions for the Grail, including Rheims. But he never found it, because in all probability, it never even existed. Heinrich Himmler was eventually captured by the Allies at the end of the war and committed suicide whilst in British custody.
This is the house in Lüneburg where Himmler committed suicide. In that room, the most despicable of all German criminals contrived to take poison after arrest.
But the horrifying truth is that millions of people across Europe would lose their lives on the direct orders of this man. Orders which the Nazis attempted to justify through the work of the Ahnenerbe and men like the Grail hunter Otto Rahn. In 1944, in the ruins of wartime Italy, elite German troops are on a special mission.
We saw people beaten up, killed. They just shot them.
They have been sent by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazis' murderous SS, to seize a precious treasure before Italy falls into Allied hands. They're searching for what has been called the Bible for the Aryan race, a book which will justify the most horrific policies of Nazi Germany.
It gives an academic justification to the idea of a difference between peoples.
This is what our ancestors used to be like, pure and unlike any other people.
Once you create the idea that some races are inferior, then you've got a legitimacy to start murdering people, by the race load.
The book is so important that Himmler will stop at nothing to get it. This is the true story of the Nazi quest for the Book of Power. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office as the Chancellor of Germany. But his hold on power was not as secure as it seemed. The Nazis had won less than half the popular vote. The nation was divided, and he needed to unite it.
You've got, in the middle of the 20th century, a country that only really exists as a concept because it was, until just a few years before, in real terms, just a collection of very, very small states. How do you unite these people? Well, the way to unite them is to create a mythology.
The myth that the Nazis hoped could unite the German people was the idea that they were descended from a race superior to all others, the Aryans. The Nazis claimed that the Aryans had originated from Atlantis, the mythical city first described by Plato as the birthplace of all civilization. They claimed that in prehistoric times, these Aryans had settled on the North German plains. They were said to be a race of tall, flaxen-haired warriors who uniquely possessed the genius to create civilization. Hitler believed that the German people were descended directly from these superhumans.
There is this need in the Nazis to demonstrate that they were a kind of cradle of civilization, that they'd been there for a long, long time.
The Nazis claimed that before the ancient Greeks and Romans were ruling the Mediterranean, the ancestors of the Germans had already spawned a great northern European civilization.
There does seem to be a tendency to want to endorse your current position in the world by taking your history as far back as it can go to show that you got there first. Perhaps you're more advanced, perhaps you're more legitimate to be in this role.
This Aryan myth was the one the Nazis believed could rally the German people to their banner.
Everything has to tie back to promote the idea that the Germans are the best, quote, race in the world.
But the fly in the ointment was that there was no proof that this master race had ever existed. But an ancient manuscript was said to exist which supported the Nazis' ideas. It told of a people who lived in Germany thousands of years before, and the Nazis believed that this book would prove all their theories to be true. It was called the Germania and was written in Rome nearly 2,000 years before. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was reaching its height, stretching from Africa and the Mediterranean to the lands of the Britons. But the Germania told of a group of people in the north of mainland Europe who even the Romans could not quell. A people called the Germanen. In 9 AD, one of Rome's most famous generals, Quintilius Varus, led an army of 3 legions to conquer the Germanen. Under their fierce warrior king, Hermann, the Germanen tribes came face to face with the Romans in the Teutoburg forests. There, they dealt the mighty empire a devastating blow. All 3 Roman legions were wiped out.
Germany for the Romans was a very emotive place, precisely because of this disaster in AD 9, where this general Quintilius Varus lost these 3 legions.
So great was the disaster, the Roman Emperor Augustus conceded that the Germanen were just too ferocious to be quelled.
Augustus decided that Germany should not be pushed further as a conquest. And that was a very powerful message to send out to subsequent emperors. It's daunting, it's forbidding.
The Nazis claimed that the modern Germans were the direct descendants of King Hermann's fearsome warriors. They also believed that the book, the Germania, held written proof of the superiority of their ancestors. The fabled Germania was written not by a German, but by the Roman senator and orator Cornelius Tacitus around the year 98 AD.
He was one of the most accomplished speakers of his generation, and he had an exemplary political career. He even became a consul and became what many people believe is the greatest Roman historian.
Tacitus wrote at the time of the most decadent period in Roman history. His works describe every sordid detail of the reigns of Rome's leaders, the Emperor Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. But for the Germanen, Tacitus was apparently full of praise.
He says that no other nation, no other group of people had troubled the Romans so much as the Germans with their strong sense of liberty.
In the book, the Germania, Tacitus describes in admiring detail the culture of the Germanen tribes, the gods they worship, how they select their kings, what weapons they use in battle, and their custom of fiercely training their youth as warriors.
Their characteristics are very much, I think, put on a pedestal as qualities that Romans actually admire. For example, their chastity and their simplicity in terms of not being interested in money, in profit, and that sort of thing.
No one in Germany laughs at vice, nor do they call it the fashion to corrupt and to be corrupted. They choose their kings by birth, their generals by merit. No nation indulges more profusely in entertainments and hospitality.
Tacitus's descriptions appeared to match the image of their ancestors that the Nazis were keen to promote to the German people.
You're presented with idealised native types who have a certain kind of purity about them and go about things in a very different way from Romans.
There's this whole tradition of reading the Germania as if it were a glorification of the noble savage.
More than that, Tacitus describes the physical characteristics of these mighty Germans. He wrote about how they had fierce blue eyes, blonde hair, and huge frames. In short, they were perfect Aryans. For the Nazis, the Germania was proof that the German people were descended from a mighty race superior to all others, and provided a direct link to their Aryan origins. And the words of Tacitus would resonate with one German in particular. In 1924, a young failed chicken farmer called Heinrich Himmler read the Germania on a long train journey and would be inspired by the words of Tacitus.
There he found, written by a Roman historian 2,000 years before, many of the things that he already believed in, so he basically found them confirmed.
After reading the Germania, the young Himmler confided to his diary,
I was lost in the glorious image of the loftiness, purity, and nobleness of our ancestors.
He wrote down in his diary that he hoped that the Germans would be so again, so it had a huge impact on him.
Himmler would go on to become one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany.
Throughout the 1930s, Himmler becomes a very, very key figure in the Third Reich. He's a very underrated figure because he's quiet and unassuming. He looks quite bookish with his little glasses and his short hair, and he's a former chicken farmer, and obviously that's quite funny. But actually, don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. This is a man, throughout the whole arc of the Nazi regime, is a man who grabs power little by little.
Himmler rose to be head of the SS, a fearsome paramilitary organization which controlled much of the Nazi state. And Himmler would shape his SS in the image of the warrior race described in the Germania.
One could in many ways say that what he promised himself in his diary in 1924, he would then try to live up to as the leader of the SS. He himself conceived of the SS as the vanguard of the future Germanic Empire.
But more than that, Himmler believed the words of Tacitus didn't just have lessons for the SS, but for all true Germans.
The Germania by Tacitus is referred to as a Bible that every thinking German should possess, because people should aspire to be as morally elevated, straightforward, honorable, direct, and brave as their Germanic ancestors allegedly had been.
Himmler wanted the Nazi state to be a reflection of the ancient German society described by Tacitus. Just as in the Germania, children were taught to swear loyalty to their leader, in this case, Adolf Hitler.
The chief fights for victory. His vassals fight for their chief.
Students were taught to be like their warrior forefathers, even wrestling and exercising with weapons.
Naked youths dance amid swords and lances that threaten their lives. Experience gives them skill, and skill again gives grace.
The Honor Cross was awarded to women who bore many children, as this was something much admired in Germanic society.
The offspring reproduced the strength of the parents.
And in the policy of Lebensraum, German people were told that the lands of neighboring countries, which had once been the home of ancient Germanic tribes, were rightfully theirs. But beyond even that, Himmler would use Tacitus to justify the most evil of all Nazi policies. In 1935, the Nazis implemented the first of many racial laws. Called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, it was an ominous first step in the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies.
It prohibits marriages between Aryan Germans and Jewish Germans.
And it was based on one paragraph of the Germania.
Key line in Germania is when Tacitus writes that the Germans are a people unto themselves, the implication being that there's no breeding with any other race or with any other people. They're a homogeneous group of people.
Tacitus said they hadn't mixed with other people. So not only were they indigenous, but they were pure and unlike any other people.
The Nazis were using the words of Tacitus to justify policies which would unleash an unimaginable terror on the world.
It gives an academic justification to the idea of a difference between peoples. And once you create the idea that some races are inferior, you then create the idea that some lives are worth less than others. And once you create that idea, then you've got a legitimacy to start murdering people, by the race load.
In other words, there is a direct link between their interpretation of the Germania and the Nazi death camps. Because of their understanding of Tacitus, over 11 million people would be murdered in the Nazi genocide.
That's how disastrously influential that particular paragraph was.
So important was this book to Nazi ideology that Himmler desperately wanted the authentic text. The trouble was that no one knew what had happened to Tacitus's original manuscript. So to find it, Himmler turned to one of the strangest and most sinister branches of the SS. It was known as the Ahnenerbe and had been created by Himmler in 1935. Unlike the Germanic warriors who made up the rest of the SS, the Ahnenerbe was an institution made up of academics.
If you want the classic example of how the Nazis manipulated intellectualism and academic behavior, you can go no further than look at the Ahnenerbe. This was an institution set up ultimately by Himmler to research, quote-unquote, German ancestry. And it was to look at how you could construct a mythology of Aryanism and Germanic culture.
The Ahnenerbe were charged with rewriting history to help Himmler to prove that the Aryan Germanic people were superior to all other races.
The Studienstiftung Ahnenerbe. There were genuine intellectuals and researchers and scientists working side by side with real cranks.
And there were around 100 academics of various different sorts working there. You had a support staff of about the same size. So you've got about 200 people. And the Ahnenerbe can't just be seen as a kind of harmless bunch of corrupted academics who were just sucking up to the Nazis. Because what they were proving was helping to create a worldview that was in essence evil.
On Himmler's orders, the Ahnenerbe began to search for Tacitus's lost manuscript. Immediately, they encountered a problem. Tacitus's original no longer existed. In the collapse of the Roman Empire and the ensuing centuries of the Dark Ages, many precious documents were lost. But a glimmer of hope remained. The Ahnenerbe discovered that the manuscript had escaped the fires of Rome. And at some point in history, a single, perfect copy of the original text had been made. But this too was missing.
Well, the survival of classical texts is often a very, very random and hazardous business. The fact that we can read the Germania today dates back to the fact that there was this one manuscript which was copied.
It was said that a traveling Italian scholar had made this beautiful word-for-word copy of the Germania in a monastery in southern Germany in the mid-15th century. This copy of the Germania became known as the Assinas Codex.
And that's the copy that Heinrich Himmler was trying to get his hands on. Because it's as close as you can get to the written account of the Germanic past.
The Ahnenerbe immediately began hunting down the Assinas Codex. They scoured the world in their search. And eventually they brought some good news to Himmler. In 1936, they reported that the book he so desperately wanted had been found. The Asinus Codex had been traced to the east of Italy. For 200 years it had lain in obscurity in the vast private library of an Italian count, the Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani.
My father was Conte Aurelio Baldeschi Guglielmi Baleani. In Italy, it's a very important title.
My father had 3 houses. One is this villa where we are now. The other one is a palace in Osimo. And the other is the palace in Iesi.
The Codex Asinus was stored in the library that they had in the Palazzo in Iesi. People had simply forgotten about it.
The Count's libraries contained many other important documents, such as the letters of Casanova and writings by Cicero.
So it's fairly easy to see how it would get overlooked.
As a result, Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani was completely unaware of how important the Asinus Codex was to the Nazis.
Tacitus or Asinus Codex was the most important book to Germany. We really never realized it was such an important thing.
It was in this library of the family, and it was not really, nobody knew how important it was.
But soon that would change.
Prima di tutto l'agricoltura, che deve trovare sbocchi per i prodotti ubertosi delle vostre terre.
In 1936, Italy was ruled over by Benito Mussolini. Like Hitler, he was another fascist leader. This brutal, populist politician had seized control of Italy in a coup d'etat in 1922 and declared himself Il Duce, the leader. And since coming to power, Hitler, the German Führer, had been carefully courting his Italian counterpart. Now, on Himmler's request, Hitler petitioned the Italian dictator to obtain the manuscript and present it to the Nazi state. It seemed that Mussolini was more than happy to oblige.
Mussolini thought, well, if Hitler wants this book very badly, it's a good idea to give it to him, to try and take it from the family.
Himmler was convinced that it was only a matter of time before he would have it in his grasp. He planned a triumphant return for the Germania at the 1936 Nazi Party convention, where hundreds of thousands of party members would be in attendance. An enormous Germanic room was built with huge panels featuring quotes from Tacitus, and above the door was a quotation from Hitler himself.
German youth shall know, manly loyalty was the virtue of the old Germanen. The new state is erected upon that virtue.
But Himmler hadn't reckoned on the stubbornness of the Count Baldeschi Baliani. An emissary from Mussolini's government was sent to meet the Count at his villa to request him to give up the Aeschines Codex. But the Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani was not used to being bossed around.
Mussolini wanted to give it to Hitler as a present, but my father actually didn't like fascism. He didn't like Mussolini.
The Count thought Mussolini was ridiculous, and he had no time for the pompous upstart's demands. So he refused to hand over the book.
He didn't want to make Mussolini too happy. He didn't want to make Hitler happy. I mean, he didn't want to give it away.
I was always proud of my father for everything. Just to say no and just to be very nonchalant about it. I think that demonstrates courage and intelligence.
Himmler was infuriated by Mussolini's failure. To make matters worse, his best hope of getting the book, Hitler, was losing interest in Himmler's obsessions.
Adolf Hitler had, in private conversations on more than one occasion, only snide comments to make. He couldn't quite see what these scholar types, so fascinated with the Germanic past, actually had to contribute to the rise of, the German state.
Himmler liked surrounding himself with all this mythology, whereas Hitler thought this was going all a little bit too far. He saw it as being unnecessary. To him, it was about politics and power.
But Himmler refused to give up. He continued to put pressure on the Baldeschi Balianis, sending his own emissaries to meet with the Count.
The interest in the book was very, very, very strong, and so they made several attempts to try and take this book from us.
Finally, after 2 years of mounting pressure, Count Aurelio made a concession. The Germans couldn't have the book, but they could at least have a look at it. Just before the outbreak of the war, the Count packed up the book and sent it to Rome, where it would be photographed for Himmler. In Rome, it was presented to Himmler's emissary.
A member of the Ahnenerbe, Rudolf Till, was given access to the Codex Aeschines in Italy, and he was able to produce a set of photographs.
The Ahnenerbe used these photographs to produce a Nazi edition of the Aeschines Codex. Himmler even wrote the foreword himself.
The future will only be granted to those who understand the stock of their ancestry.
But for Himmler, even this was not enough. All he had was a facsimile. He was determined to possess the original. And one day, he would have the chance to take it. In 1939, Hitler plunged the world into war. Under Mussolini, Italy was Germany's most important ally. The two dictators eventually found themselves fighting both the Western powers and Russia. After 4 bloody years, the tide of the war turned against the fascist nations. In 1943, Allied forces landed in the south of Italy. Benito Mussolini was overthrown by an Italian revolt, and Italy switched its allegiance to the Allies. To shore up his southern flank, Hitler was forced to send German troops into Italy. Himmler now saw an opportunity to seize the Asinus Codex from the Baldeschi-Balliani family. So with the German advance, Himmler now sent an entire unit of his own SS troops to the region, with the express purpose of tracking the book down. But where was it? The Baldeschi-Ballianis had 3 properties: 2 town palazzi and a country villa. The book could be in any one of them, or none of them. First, Himmler's soldiers were sent to the Balliani's main residence, his villa outside the town of Jesi.
After Mussolini was dead, at the end, the Germans came looking themselves for the book.
But they found the villa empty. Days before, the Count had moved his family out of the villa to one of his other properties to protect them. But Himmler's troops did discover one thing. The Count's servants had taken everything of value from the villa to another of his properties, his palazzo in the town of Jesi, only a few miles away. The Count's treasures had been smuggled out in agricultural carts, hidden from the Germans beneath piles of farm produce.
There were many cars that were going at that time in the center of the town of Jesi, so lots of things were hidden under the wheat and under the grapes.
Could it be that the Asinus Codex was among the valuables? So now Himmler's troops rushed to the palazzo in Jesi.
They asked for the book in a very aggressive way. And also here, the waiters and the chauffeurs and all the people working in the house, maybe pretending they didn't understand the language, maybe risking also their life, because I mean, at those times, life was not so safe like it can be today in this kind of situation.
But once again, Himmler's troops found nothing. Neither the Germania nor the Baldeschi family were in the villa at Jesi. Himmler's SS now turned their attentions to the third of the Count's properties, another palazzo 30 kilometers away in the town of Osimo.
My family, they all moved to Osimo. They moved there because they were thinking that it was more safe.
From their hiding place in Osimo, the Baldeschi-Ballianis witnessed the horrors of life under the Germans.
My brother and I used to look from the window and were really petrified because we saw people beaten up, killed. They just shot them. And so that was really a very, very horrible thing to see. And my parents didn't know we were seeing it, but I mean, children, you know, they climb up on a window and look down.
Eventually, Himmler's soldiers arrived at the palazzo itself.
It was all locked, the house.
They knocked at the door.
They were knocking at the door. I remember this very vividly, and I remember how scared we were that they could break down the door and take my father and kill him.
As the Germans searched the palazzo, the family hid in the cellars below.
I was 10 years old. My brother, one was 9, the other was even less. It was a terrible experience. We spent 18 days down in the cellars without ever coming up.
Himmler's soldiers scoured the house. But they never found the cellar door, and the Baleski-Baliani family remained safe. So did the book. May the 8th, 1945 brought an end to 6 years of war in Europe. The Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich based on the foundations of an ancient Germanic culture had come to nothing. Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker. And Heinrich Himmler swallowed a cyanide capsule whilst in British custody.
This is the house in Lüneburg where Himmler committed suicide. In that room, the most despicable of all German criminals contrived to take poison.
With the war over, the truth about the elusive Asinus Codex would begin to emerge. Did this book really justify the Nazis' murderous policies? And anyway, where was it? One mystery was easily solved. The book had never moved from the first place that Himmler's troops had gone searching for it. The Baldeschi-Baliani's villa outside Jesi had a secret room.
This room has a false window. From the outside you see it, but in fact it's not a window that you can open.
The room with the false window had a hidden door, concealed by a wardrobe.
The door that was already a safety door by itself was also protected by furniture.
So then you can even see the door.
Behind the wardrobe and the hidden door sat a simple chest.
Inside this room there is this cassaforte, we say in Italian. Usually you keep laundry inside.
Concealed inside a pile of laundry lay the thing that had so obsessed Himmler. Tacitus's Germania. With the threat of the Nazis gone, the Baldeschi-Balianis no longer had to hide the book. The Italian government now recognized it as a national treasure, and the Baldeschi-Balianis would display it with pride in their library in Jesi for the next 20 years.
Every year, the Italian government sent some inspectors to see if the book was still with us, if it was well kept.
One year, the inspectors asked the Count to bring the book to Florence, as they couldn't make it to Jesi.
In 1966, they were in Florence, these inspectors, and they said, well, I'll take the book to Florence and I'll show you the book there.
The Count took the book to Florence in person, where he placed it in an underground bank vault overnight for safekeeping. The following day, he would take it to the inspectors. But then disaster.
That was the night of the flood in Florence.
November the 4th, 1966, saw the worst flooding in Florence's history. And water found what Himmler never could.
A flood came, and they weren't waterproof. So all the water with the gas, with the oil and paintings, they all went completely ruined.
This manuscript was ruined for the first 2 or 3 pages, and the last 2 or 3 pages, it was seriously damaged.
The first and the last pages were almost black. The writing looked like a negativa.
It looked as if this treasure had been destroyed forever. Months of costly and painstaking restoration followed, and the damage of the flooding was undone. Today, the Essenes Codex sits in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome. After nearly 200 years of holding the book, the Baldeschi-Baliani family had decided that the Essenes Codex should be available for all to see.
Little by little, we decided that this book was better if it was kept in a public place. And so then we gave it to the state, and it went to Rome, to the National Library in Rome.
Now that the oldest version of Tacitus's manuscript can be studied by experts from all nations, a very different picture of the ancient Germans than that promoted by Himmler has emerged. For a start, Tacitus was not as enraptured with the Germanen as Himmler had made out.
Tacitus attributes several clearly negative characteristics to the Germanic tribes. He basically speaks of their tendency towards drunkenness.
To pass an entire day and night in drinking disgraces no one. Their quarrels are seldom fought out with mere abuse, but commonly with wounds and bloodshed.
They were represented as liking their drink too much and having banquets, feasts during the day, this sort of thing.
They themselves lie buried in sloth, a strange combination in their nature that the same men should be so fond of idleness, so averse to peace.
He explicitly writes about their almost addiction to gambling. He also comments on what he describes as a form of laziness, basically.
They pass much of their time in idleness, giving themselves up to sleep and to feasting, the bravest and the most warlike doing nothing.
A sort of simple society, but one which has its flaws.
In fact, what Tacitus described was far from the perfect Aryan society claimed by Himmler.
In every household, the children, naked and filthy. They will be overcome by their own vices as easily as by the arms of an enemy.
It has become increasingly clear that the Ahnenerbe had only taken from Tacitus what they could use to support Himmler's theories of Germany's noble Aryan ancestors.
They blatantly misinterpreted, misread, and misquoted particular passages that didn't really fit their particular ideological view to make it fit their ideological view.
They've been highly selective. They've taken little bits of it, primarily around chapter 4, where he's talking about their racial purity, their blue eyes, their blonde hair, that sort of thing. And they've taken this work and very much, I think, made it what they want it to be.
And the Nazis had chosen to keep hidden another key fact about Tacitus. He had almost certainly never even seen any of the Germanen he was writing about, and had no real evidence for his statements about them. Some of his descriptions were plainly made up.
By the end of the monograph, you have this fantasy, bizarre sort of image of people with human faces but the bodies of animals. So it begins to enter the world of the fantastic. So you have to be wary of that when you're reading these texts.
Himmler also willfully ignored another fact. Modern-day Germans could not be the direct descendants of the Germanen.
The Nazis, in referring to the Germanic tribes, referred to them as ancient Germans or the old Germans. And that's exactly the kind of step that you must not make, because it is a simplification.
The Germani are different from the people that we would think of today as Germans. That's just the name that came to be used for the whole group of people.
They misidentified the German ancestors with the Germanic tribes that Tacitus describes, so you simply can't say that the Germanic tribes were the German ancestors.
The truth was that Hitler's Germans were descendants of many different peoples, not a single ancient tribe.
There was no German nation, and the whole tribal situation changed dramatically several times over the following centuries. So you can't simply say, those are our ancestors.
But Himmler was unconcerned about the truth of what Tacitus really said, and the truth of the origins of the German people. He desired the Asinus Codex to help promote the vicious and racist policies of the Nazis. And the tragic fact is that even without ever laying his hands on the original, he was still able to use the words of Tacitus to aid the Nazis in their murderous policies, which resulted in the death of millions.
In 1938, an amazing expedition set out to explore a remote, sacred land beyond the Himalayas, Tibet.
The expedition was an extraordinary achievement. Those months they spent in that strange land, opening it up.
The explorers were a team of elite Nazi scientists, led by a glamorous adventurer.
He was the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Dispatched on a mission by the most feared man in Nazi Germany, Heinrich Himmler. His quest was as audacious as it was ambitious. To find evidence that linked German Aryans to the ancient super race of a lost empire.
If only Tibet could yield up, the land of the snows could yield up its secrets.
This is Himmler's quest to find the fabled lost people of Atlantis. In 1936, one of Nazi Germany's rising stars, 26-year-old zoologist Ernst Schaefer, was officially summoned to SS headquarters in Berlin. He had an appointment with the most powerful and feared man in the Third Reich. Not Adolf Hitler, but Heinrich Himmler. As Reichsführer, Himmler commanded an elite SS paramilitary force 250,000 strong. a black-clad army dedicated to the supremacy of the German race. He was chief of all police throughout Germany, including the secret police, the brutal Gestapo. Himmler organized the arrest and detention of Jews as controller of a growing number of concentration camps.
The SS was a huge set of tentacles reach out into Germany, and they're SS tentacles, and Himmler is chief of them.
Now Himmler's tentacles were reaching out to envelop the young scientist Ernst Schaefer. Himmler wanted him to solve a problem. The Nazis claimed that the Germans were the master race, destined to rule. This ideology justified the Germans' domination of Europe and hatred of the Jews. Himmler needed German superiority to be proved a fact. For his proof, he turned to an ancient myth, the lost world of Atlantis. Atlantis was described as a vast continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Its people were elite humans who conquered and dominated all other cultures and races. The empire of Atlantis reached into Europe, Africa, and South America. But for Himmler, Atlantis wasn't a story, but historical fact.
So Atlantis, he came to believe, Himmler, had actually existed. It wasn't a myth, but it was also scientifically based. There had been an Atlantis.
Getting evidence that the descendants of the Atlanteans were none other than the German people wasn't easy. The island of Atlantis disappeared in a day and a night. It was destroyed by earthquakes and volcanoes, consumed by the ocean, and lost beneath the waves forever. Far from the Atlantean civilization being lost in the cataclysm, Himmler believed it lived on. He held that Atlantis gave birth to every great civilization: the Greeks, the Romans, the Mayans and Aztecs of South America, even the ancient Egyptians. That these inferior peoples had been bequeathed their culture by the superior people of Atlantis.
From the very beginning, it's all to do with race. Racism impregnates the Atlantis myth. It's about a superior race of beings who spread this knowledge around the world.
Himmler had a specific mission for Schaefer. He was to lead an SS scientific expedition and bring him proof that German Aryans were the descendants of this superior race, the lost people of Atlantis. Himmler had chosen Schaefer in particular for this task, not only for his scientific credentials, but because he was already a famous explorer. In 1930s Germany, Dr. Ernst Schaefer cut a heroic figure. He'd been a member of 2 American-led expeditions into Tibet. He was a fastidious scientist and passionate hunter who loved to study mammals and birds in the wild, and after he'd shot them. An ambitious self-publicist, he wrote books about his exploits as a young sharpshooting adventurer. They made him a celebrity in Germany.
He becomes, for Germans, an embodiment of the ideal German in a way. I think that's how Himmler regarded him. A sort of heroic, brave, physically resourceful. The cliché would be Indiana Jones, the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Ernst Schaefer was the ideal person to lead the SS scientific expedition into Tibet. Himmler pledged him his personal support. Himmler told Schaefer that in ancient times, survivors of Atlantis had founded a great civilization in Asia. One mysterious country least diluted by the centuries of history was remote Tibet.
For Heinrich Himmler, Tibet had an extraordinary appeal. The supermen of the Aryan race had gone there and in the fastness of Tibet had re-established their culture and their ways, cut off, remote from the outside world.
In the 1930s, Tibet was one of the few scientifically unresearched areas of the world. Situated in the center of Asia, but isolated by the Himalayan mountains, the Tibetan plateau covers nearly 1 million square miles at an altitude of up to 15,000 feet. Could this natural fortress have sheltered survivors of Atlantis? If they did settle there, then the isolation would have kept them racially pure. They would be distant cousins of the German master race.
If Tibet could be reopened and the evidence of the supermen of the past be rediscovered, here was the best proof possible of the validity of the argument that modern Germany and the Nazi movement and the Aryans of Germany now were directly related to the supermen.
Tibet at this point in time was so unexplored compared to other regions of the world that any expedition to Tibet would be a big coup.
To lead his own expedition into Tibet was a dream come true for the ambitious Schaefer. But there was a sting in the tail. Doing science for the SS meant doing it the SS way. In 1935, Himmler set up the Ahnenwerber, a research organization within the SS. Its job was to prove Nazi ideology.
The idea is to help a number of German scientists dig into the past of the German peoples and in a way to endorse them as the superior people of Europe.
The Ahnenwerber recruited corrupt scientists and scholars prepared to ransack Germany's past and glorify it.
We would say that Ahnenwerber is an attempt to rewrite history. Himmler claimed it was a rediscovery of the true German history. And that's why all aspects of archaeology, philology, semantics, language, you name it, any ology or onomy, it had to be taken into Ahnenwerber because those elements could become means by which the truth of the great German past could be rediscovered.
What is remarkable is that the German state of the time, the Nazi state, certainly according to the SS chief Heinrich Himmler, needed to create its own mythologies.
The ancient swastika symbol was appropriated to represent Nazi power and signify their hatred of what they saw as inferior peoples. The Ahnenwerber also undermined what it saw as anti-German science. Even the great Einstein, because he was Jewish.
German nationalists resented the achievements of Jewish scientists, and they came up with an absurd idea that their science was in some way Jewish and therefore not wanted in Germany. And this did force them to validate science that was really very mediocre, if not absurd.
Schaefer's scientific pride faced an even bigger challenge. Himmler's quasi-historical account of Atlantis, backed by the Ahnenwerber's pseudoscience, was to him a fantasy without foundation. As a scientist, he didn't believe a word of it. Schaefer thought that he could ride the Nazi tiger, and that this expedition would ensure a glittering scientific career.
I think he was quite ambitious in many ways, but also very much willing to manipulate people, willing to manipulate institutions so that he would get what he wanted.
Desperate to return to Tibet, Schaefer couldn't resist Himmler's offer. So Schaefer made a devil's pact with Himmler. To realize his ambition, he agreed to an impossible task. And ultimately, he would pay a heavy price. Ernst Schaefer was a political animal, always able to manipulate a situation to his advantage. Or so he thought. In 1933, Schaefer had been studying for his doctorate when Hitler was elected Reichschancellor of Germany and the Nazis swept to power. The Nazis' racial policies caused many Jews to leave the country, as did many scientific researchers. But Schaefer embraced the new order and signed up to Himmler's increasingly powerful SS. In Nazi Germany, that's how ambitious young scientists got ahead.
It was actually very sensible of Schaefer to join the SS in 1933. He was ambitious. He had unusual ambitions. He didn't just want a university seat. He wanted support for his work as a naturalist. He rightly believed that the SS would back him.
He himself said that politics serves science and science serves politics. If he could make that illusion himself, then it would justify and explain why he was so willing, so ready to join a political movement, because it gave him the scientific freedom to pursue the researches that he believed was his mission.
But Schaefer found the realities of mixing politics and science impossible from the start. Schaefer's meticulous scientific methods would never chime with Himmler's bizarre cut-and-paste theories. So while Schaefer benefited from official SS support, he also suffered from official SS interference. The Ahnenerbe plied him with its preferred candidates to join the SS expedition to Tibet. Corrupt archaeologists, self-styled mystics, and pseudoscientists.
Now, the Ahnenerbe is very curious because there are some genuine scientists working for it. They're probably rather embarrassed. But there are some cranks as well. You have a fellow called Willigut, or Weisthor, who is literally insane. And yet, Himmler regards him as a kind of guru, as a wise man. People like Schaefer, they're appalled when they stumble on people like Willigut. You can imagine their reaction, what am I doing here with people like this?
Pseudoscience was anathema to the rigorous and ambitious Schaefer. Risking Himmler's wrath, Schaefer rejected the Ahnenerbe's candidates.
Schaefer was able to resist some of the more overt pressure that Himmler was putting on him. Schaefer also was able to keep his distance from the Ahnenerbe, the ancestral heritage, as such, and be semi-independent, really, of all of it.
Schaefer's vision was very different and very clear. He wanted to conduct an objective scientific survey of Tibet, a comprehensive study of its terrain and wildlife, of its people and their customs. It was a holistic approach to science ahead of its time. The great naturalist Charles Darwin had the Galapagos Islands. Ernst Schaefer would have Tibet.
Schaefer and a number of other European naturalists believed that the Himalayas were a kind of source point for many different species, if not all species in the world. So to go to the Himalayas, which is where Tibet is, was a means of going back to the source, of understanding how species developed and spread across the world.
There was a theory that Tibet was essentially like a sort of waterfall of species, and that there was something interesting happening there genetically.
Schaefer wrote a manifesto describing the kind of men he wanted to take with him.
An ideologically homogeneous, healthy team, comradeship according to soldierly principles, in which each member possesses, in addition to his sound knowledge of his subject, of which he is a master, also as much versatility as possible.
Schaefer wanted true scientists, but he was still playing a political game. Himmler wanted each scientist to have one vital qualification: membership of the SS.
There were plenty of academics in this period who were not members of the SS. So I think Schaefer took a lot of SS members partly because that brought prestige, partly that made sure that Himmler would not necessarily withdraw his patronage.
To achieve his vision of pure scientific research, Schaefer himself would go as zoologist, ornithologist, botanist, and of course team leader. As team geologist, he chose 24-year-old Karl Wienert, and as entomologist, 38-year-old Ernst Krause.
There was one member of the expedition was interested in Tibetan insects, butterflies and so on. Another member of the expedition was meticulously taking geomagnetic readings at different points across the Himalayas. I don't think you can really say there is a Nazi kind of butterfly collector, or that there is anything political about geomagnetism.
But Schaefer couldn't ignore Himmler's quest to find evidence of an ancient Nordic invasion of Tibet. So he did accept one Ahnenerbe candidate onto his team, 26-year-old anthropologist Bruno Beger.
When you come to Bruno Beger, the expedition anthropologist, I think you are looking at a political scientific research project, which is to investigate the connections between the peoples of the Himalayas and Europeans.
Deciphering a person's racial heritage was Beger's speciality. He'd been trained to do this by measuring people. Skull shape and facial features were thought by racial anthropologists to be particularly important. They separated what they saw as the superior Aryan race from the inferior races.
Bruno Beger had done some research on racial theories and racial mixing in particular. He had worked with Hafka Günther, who was a very famous big shot amongst racial scientists in the Third Reich.
Schaefer realized racial anthropology was essential to the success of his expedition. He needed Beger. He was the only person who might find the evidence Himmler had asked him to provide.
Beger and Schaefer at this point both really believe in a lot of the ideas that are around in National Socialist Germany. They do primarily see themselves as scientists in their future careers, really. The problem with that, however, of course, is that science and politics are very, very closely linked in Nazi Germany. You can't have science without the politics.
Himmler believed they would produce enough evidence to justify the expedition itself, and it would add to his dream of recreating a German culture linked very directly to the Aryan past.
Schaefer had his team in place. After a year of preparation, he was ready to lead his expedition into Tibet. But his timing couldn't have been worse. By the spring of 1938, Europe was in political turmoil. The German war machine was gearing up. The Nazis had reoccupied the Rhineland taken from Germany at the end of the First World War, and now marched into German-speaking Austria, the first steps to a greater Germany. The international situation didn't stop Schaefer's expedition setting out from Berlin on April the 19th, 1938. But it could stop him getting to Tibet. War in Asia left Schaefer only one possible route to Tibet, through India. And this brought him into direct conflict with the British Empire. Tibet was a nominally independent country, ruled in the absence of the young Dalai Lama by a regent and a council of ministers. The British ensured they were the only Europeans allowed to advise the Tibetan government.
The British at this point in time weren't really that keen on allowing Schaefer into Tibet. However, that wasn't necessarily completely uncharacteristic. The British had never been particularly keen on allowing foreign expeditions into Tibet. The Tibetan government itself was also never particularly keen on allowing anyone other than the British into Tibet.
Schaefer nevertheless sailed via the Suez Canal for India. In this sensitive situation, he played down the SS support for his expedition to avoid antagonizing the British. But a Nazi newspaper ran a glowing article celebrating the expedition's glorious SS connections. Before Schaefer even arrived, British and Indian newspapers burst into print, with headlines screaming, "Gestapo agent in India." They were accused of being German spies. It was a disaster for Schaefer. The British authorities didn't give the German expedition permission even to enter India. The precious expedition Schaefer had prepared for all his life was over before it had even started. Again, Himmler's personal support was crucial. He wrote a bitter letter of complaint to Britain, read by the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
You know yourself that up to now my attitude towards every Englishman who has come to Germany has been entirely friendly. For that reason, I am the more astonished that the English should treat one of my men in a brusque, wounding and unfriendly way. I cannot imagine the authorities are so stupid as to see in the scientist Dr. Schaefer, officially dispatched by me, a spy.
Despite the gathering pace of Nazi Germany's war machine, Britain was still trying to appease Hitler. So after Himmler's intervention, the British backed down.
Appeasement is the big word of the time. That Britain has accepted that avoidance of war is the prime consideration, and therefore wants amicable relations, as far as they can be achieved, with Germany.
The British eventually gave Schaefer permission to go into northern India, to explore the remote province of Sikkim. But he was expressly forbidden to enter Tibet without official leave. Schaefer was not a man to take no for an answer, but he had to take what he could get, for the time being. Once in Sikkim, Schaefer expanded his operation, hiring porters and pack horses, buying food and equipment. Despite being forbidden to enter Tibet, Schaefer also hired Tibetan speakers. As close as possible to the Tibet border, Schaefer set his team to work on their varied scientific research, collecting data for his scientific survey and also for Himmler's quest for European traits he believed would racially link the German people to the Atlantean super race. Sikkim became a place of great interest to Bega.
There are many people in northern India who are descended from Tibetans, so Bega had a lot to start with.
For an anthropologist and ethnologist like Bega, the races of this remote area were fascinating. As Schaefer noted,
nearly all these fragment tribes have preserved their own cultures and their own languages and are distinguished by well-marked racial characteristics.
Bega made meticulous measurements, compared eye color to a chart, and compared hair color to graded samples. No detail was too small or obscure for his specialist equipment to measure.
He'd brought a vast array of scientific instruments, which could all be ordered from scientific mail catalogues in the Third Reich, really. One particularly outlandish instrument that he brought was an instrument designed to measure the curvature of fingernails, for instance.
Racial anthropologists measured racial identity and status in the shape of the skeleton, and in particular, the skull. The cephalic index was the ratio between the breadth and depth of the head. A long, narrow Teutonic head indicated North European ancestry.
He would measure the ratio between your forehead and your nose, the distance between your eyebrows, and all sorts of very intricate measurements. And although it seems rather crude now, he is in a way measuring your genetic inheritance.
If they could prove by physical measurement of the head and the face and so on, that indeed the Tibetans were a direct link physically with modern Germans, then the link between the Supermen notion settled in the Shangri-La of Tibet and modern Germany would be made.
Beger's expert measurements of the short, dark-skinned, black-haired peoples of Sikkim would struggle to find evidence for Himmler's fantasy of the superhuman, blonde, blue-eyed conquerors of Tibet. Himmler wanted evidence of a dominant strain of people. In his mind, these would naturally form the upper class, the Tibetan ruling elite.
He's particularly interested in Tibetan aristocrats in Lhasa, and he wants to find a connection between the Tibetan elite and Nordic peoples.
But the British had condemned Schaefer to fester in Sikkim. As weeks turned into months, he realized his expedition was doomed to fail if they couldn't get over the Tibetan border. He wrote in his diary,
"We are at Tibet's frontier. It is the realm of our most powerful yearning. Up there, not far away at all, is the border pass."
The border haunted Schaefer's imagination. There was nothing physically to stop him.
There are neither guards nor sentinels, neither barrier nor gates. At that lonely altitude, there is only an oboe, a heap of stones wrapped in prayer flags.
Schaefer, in desperation, was even considering sneaking over the border. If he did, he risked more damaging anti-Nazi headlines and an international incident. But if he didn't, he'd face Himmler's fury.
No one on the expedition wants to go back to Germany, having not got to Tibet. So for Schaefer, this is a crisis moment.
He'd put up a massive expedition, put a lot of personal effort and investment into all of this.
Somehow he has to cross the Himalayas. Otherwise he's going to lose face in Germany. He doesn't want to be humiliated.
Schaefer was torn. He felt honor bound to resist the temptation.
"I have promised the Viceroy not to cross the Tibetan border without official leave. And as a German, I'm not willing to break a promise. But what does official leave mean?"
Schaefer was looking for a way to wriggle out of his promise to the British. And he was in luck. One day, Beger noticed a rather well-dressed Tibetan riding past the camp. He recorded the event in his diary.
Suddenly, a Tibetan appeared. My next thought is to measure him. Then our native translator whispers to us that this is a high official.
Here was an important advisor to a man of influence. Tering Raja, a Tibetan prince who ruled the province just over the forbidden border. Schaefer seized the opportunity to ingratiate himself with the Tibetan ruling class. The charm offensive might be his first step on the road to Lhasa. The team got off to a good start, observing Tibetan protocols as they served tea. Schaefer, they made out, was a great and powerful leader. Schaefer, in his turn, spoke of his love of Tibet and how he yearned to see Lhasa, and they showered their honored guest with gifts. Schaefer gave him a begging letter in Tibetan to take to his master, Tering Raja. He hoped the prince might intercede with the ruling council to let him enter Tibet. It was a slim hope, and all Schaefer could do was wait. As the summer of 1938 slipped into autumn, Schaefer remained isolated on the India-Tibet border. It seemed that the British had won. He was trapped. Then, after 5 months of waiting, a letter from Lhasa.
To the German Herr Dr. Schaefer, Master of 100 Sciences.
First, the ruling council declared that Tibet is forever prohibited to foreigners, but then the letter took on a more friendly tone.
It nevertheless appears from your letter that you intend only friendship and to see the Holy Land and its religious institutions.
Then at last the translator read the news they thought would never come.
We grant you permission to enter Lhasa and stay there for 14 days.
The elation was indescribable. All 5 German scientists were invited by the Tibetan ruling council to visit Lhasa for 2 weeks. Schaefer had wriggled out of his promise to the British. Here was the longed-for official leave.
It was pretty spectacular getting these German scientists into Lhasa.
Getting into Lhasa was a big propaganda coup, really, for Nazi Germany. Particularly so since the Nazis did, at this point in time, make a lot out of the fact that Germans could supposedly deal with non-European peoples better than the British.
With news of the historic invitation, Himmler promoted the whole team. Schaefer to the rank of Hauptsturmführer, a captain in the SS. On January the 19th, 1939, Schaefer saw the Dalai Lama's vast Potala Palace towering over Lhasa. It was an historic occasion. They were the first Germans ever to enter the holy city. The Tibetan government had officially invited Schaefer, so he expected a grand welcome. But just a single official greeted them. A British representative in Lhasa had intervened and changed the ruling council's minds. Schaefer's great coup would soon turn to abject failure if the nobles of Lhasa ignored his expedition. Now Schaefer the politician got to work. Showing due deference, he lavished the finest gifts on the ministers and nobility of Lhasa.
What Schaefer did in Lhasa, there was definitely a fair bit of politics. Schaefer was trying to build up friendly relations with the Tibetan government. Up until that point in time, the Tibetan government had only really dealt with the British government.
Schaefer paid particular attention to the regent, Rating Rinpoche, the ruler of Tibet. Schaefer found he had a unique advantage over the British in getting close to the Tibetans. Germany and Tibet, he told them, shared a common bond: the swastika. For centuries, Tibetans had regarded the ancient symbol as a sign of good fortune and permanence. Schaefer made gifts of Nazi emblems, explaining to his hosts how revered the symbol was in Germany. The Tibetans were delighted, not knowing that in Europe at that very moment, the swastika was a symbol of oppression and violence. With this deception, Schaefer scored another great political coup.
The regent later on sent a letter back home to Hitler, addressing him as the German king, and asked for more contact between Germany and Tibet and friendly relations.
To His Majesty Adolf Hitler, I have pleasure to let Your Majesty know that Dr. Schaefer and his party, who are the first Germans to visit Tibet, have been allowed without any objection, and every necessary assistance is rendered on their arrival.
Thanks to Schaefer's access, the ruling council gave the Germans unprecedented freedom to film Lhasa, its monasteries and medieval setting. Schaefer and his team documented the exotic streets and markets with their rich variety of food and cloth and jewelry. But Schaefer's personal research was suffering. The wonderful letter from Lhasa had also imposed a terrible condition that struck at the heart of why Schaefer was in Tibet at all: hunting. It was a bitter blow. Schaefer had traveled halfway round the world only to be banned from collecting wildlife for his own research. Well, not quite. Schaefer did manage to hunt, but quietly, mainly with a catapult and only the occasional bullet, when no one was about.
Schaefer, of course, did really circumvent some of the conditions, although not in a very ostentatious manner.
Beger's work also suffered a severe setback. During the colourful New Year festival, as Schaefer and the team filmed the magnificent dances and parades, they got too close with their cameras and were stoned and injured by angry monks. After that, Beger's work measuring people was considered by the team to be provocative and foolhardy. A frustrated Beger saw an extraordinary variety of people slip through his fingers. Shaven-headed monks in dark red robes, burly yak herders dressed in heavy sheepskin, delicate officials in shimmering chubas, and what he described as many beautiful and tall people with even features. He couldn't gather any hard physiological data that might fulfill Himmler's quest. Yet while the science expedition was stalled, the Germans remained great friends of the regent. He extended the expedition's stay from 2 weeks to 2 months. Schaefer had sidelined the British, much to their annoyance.
Well, the British were worried partly that Schaefer would be able to stoke up anti-British sentiment in Tibet. In fact, this becomes more and more of an issue throughout 1939 as appeasement in Europe started to fail.
In September 1938, in a spirit of appeasement, the British had brokered the Munich Agreement and let Nazi Germany occupy the largely German-speaking Sudetenland, then part of Czechoslovakia. But 2 months later came Kristallnacht, one night of violence by brown shirts and civilians that left 91 Jews dead and 30,000 in concentration camps. The true nature of Nazism had been revealed. The time for appeasement was over. The Germans still enjoyed official approval. His team were allowed to leave Lhasa to explore the holiest places in Tibet, banned even to the British. But as they explored the sacred Yarlung Valley east of Lhasa, they began to receive messages urging them to return home to Germany.
Schaefer was keen to stay and explore areas that hadn't been explored by many other people, just to make his expedition special, just to really enable him to use what he was doing to obtain fame, really, back in Germany.
A European war seemed increasingly likely, even inevitable. If they waited much longer, they risked being interned by the British as enemy aliens. The expedition was running out of time. By March 1939, Nazi Germany had expanded east again to occupy Bohemia and Moravia. But Britain had a mutual assistance pact with Poland, and any further German advance into Poland could not be so easily ignored. Europe was on the brink of war. Even the ebullient Schaefer was becoming increasingly anxious about British intentions and began to fear arrest and detention in India. Bager reported that in the summer of 1939, Schaefer received a letter from his father and was so deeply affected by it that he disappeared for an hour.
His father pointed out there's a war coming, and he said to the son, if I were you, I would make the best of what you've had and return.
If Schaefer wanted a chance of actually getting all his samples and specimens and data back to Germany and make something out of them and make a name for himself, he really needed to leave before war broke out.
Bager wrote that he and the others were also being warned they were in danger.
We sat around the fireplace and discussed it. Suddenly we realized a letter and transmission from Berlin had the same message. My wife had been hinting too.
The war, they were told, would start after the summer. That was only weeks away. It was time to go home to Germany. Despite the rising political tension and Schaefer's fears of capture and detention, the team were allowed safe passage through India by the British. The 5 SS officers were even able to fly out of Calcutta with British Indian Airways. But what would Himmler have to say about Schaefer's lack of evidence for his quest for the people of Atlantis? And what might he do? Even worse, when the team touched down in Munich, Heinrich Himmler himself would be there waiting. Now would come the reckoning. But Himmler welcomed Schaefer and his team as heroes.
Here were fine young men, great scientists, you could call them, or young Germans at their best. It showed them opening up the world, or restoring the evidence, looking for the evidence, being adventurous, giving Germany that sense of encompassing some of the best virtues and values of a modern civilization linked to the Aryan past. That they didn't make the link in physical hard terms, in a sense, didn't matter. The expedition in itself was its own justification.
Himmler was elated by Schaefer's achievements. In Tibet, he had trounced the British and proven German dominance in the region.
The propaganda value of the expedition was definitely greater than the scientific value of the expedition. Himmler certainly was delighted by the outcome, shaking the expedition members' hands at the airport.
Just 27 days later, Nazi Germany, fatally committed to its policy of territorial and racial domination, invaded Poland. The Second World War began. Schaefer was not yet 30 when he returned to Germany a national hero. But what had his extraordinary expedition to Tibet actually achieved? Schaefer's personal scientific vision came to nothing. Most of the huge amount of data his hand-picked team of scientists gathered lay unexamined and then lost in the tumult of war. What of the proof of the super race of Atlantis? It seems Himmler had asked the wrong guys. He'd certainly asked the wrong question. Even racial anthropologist Bruno Beger had found the Atlantis Nordic idea hard to swallow.
Beger was trying to find out what kind of racial mixture there was in Tibet. I don't think Beger's research was as grand as believing the Nordic race had changed all of Asian history.
Bruno Beger said that when they were gathered around the campfire in northern India or Tibet, they would reminisce about some of Himmler's stranger views and laugh about them.
But these men, as SS scientists, were supporting Nazi ideology, working with a man whose crimes were beyond imagining.
Heinrich Himmler, let's not forget he was a super efficient bureaucrat who created a state within a state that carried out the worst genocide in human history. So we shouldn't reduce him to an eccentric or a crank.
Himmler, to avoid trial for his crimes and death by hanging, committed suicide after the war. In February 1943, Beger was sent to Auschwitz to make facial masks of prisoners. Soon afterwards, 109 Jews he had worked on were gassed for an infamous Nazi project, the Jewish Skull Collection. In 1971, Beger was tried and convicted as an accomplice to murder. He received a 3-year suspended sentence. After the war, Schaefer's glittering career evaporated. He took a job creating a wildlife park in Venezuela, one of the sanctuaries for Nazis in South America. Schaefer's life was cursed by his membership of the SS and close association with the evil Heinrich Himmler.
In 1941, the Germans were marching through Russia. They weren't just grabbing territory, they were also stealing priceless works of art. One of them was the Amber Room, an extraordinary series of 18th century amber screens worth millions of pounds.
It was regarded as an eighth wonder of the world.
This fabulous artifact was taken to the German city of Königsberg. But 4 years later, when the Allies retook the city in 1945, the Amber Room had mysteriously disappeared. Was it destroyed in the fighting? Or had it been hidden? It was the beginning of a treasure hunt that would draw in some of the most powerful secret police forces in Eastern Europe.
There would be searches, official and unofficial, sponsored by East Germany, by the Stasi, by the KGB.
There would be false starts, missing records, and fabricated stories.
Stasi spent more and more money and more time because they wanted the glory.
It would become one of the great treasure hunts of the 20th century. A hunt that continues today.
We are very close of finding the Amber Room, but we just need help.
The Ore Mountains in southeast Germany. an area of wooded hillsides and disused mines. Here, for the last 20 years, Henry Hattenhauer has been searching for an extraordinary missing artifact. It's a looted Russian treasure that disappeared at the end of World War II, never to be seen again. Hattenhauer is convinced it's hidden in one of the region's derelict slate mines.
We went to practically every mine in this county, no matter how old it was. I estimate that we have explored about 150 mines, more or less.
Hattenhauer has kept a meticulous record of the search. It's so secretive, members of the team don't want to be identified.
We even have our own surveyor team, if you're going to call it like that, drawing maps, measuring tunnels, measuring holes, everything.
For his small group of treasure hunters, it's been painstaking and risky work.
You cannot just walk in and open the tunnel where it is collapsed, because it's extremely dangerous and you need to secure yourself from falling stones.
Yet after years of disappointment, Hattenhauer believes he has finally traced the missing treasure to one particular mine. If he's right, he could be on the brink of a monumental discovery. A 60-year search may be over. Hattenhauer may have found the legendary Amber Room. It was one of the most extraordinary artifacts ever created. The so-called Amber Room was a series of panels lining a palatial chamber.
The old Amber Room must have been absolutely glorious. Would have been a wondrous sight. Nothing on that scale had been attempted before. Some of it was carved in 3 dimensions, crowns and things.
What made it absolutely astonishing was the incredible quality of the workmanship.
This figure, I'm not sure whether he's carved in one piece or not, one single piece, because the arm is a different color to the rest of the body.
This extraordinary creation was built by 18th century German craftsmen using millions of pieces of amber.
And in the back here we have the mosaic, the background for the whole thing, where they have taken slices of amber and fitted them together so that they make this mosaic with no gaps. The whole thing is amber.
Amber is a semi-precious substance only found in a few parts of the world. One of the main sources is the Baltic coast of Poland. It's formed from the resin of prehistoric trees that grew in the region 60 million years ago. During the early 1700s, the Amber Room became a symbol of German craftsmanship at its most magnificent.
It was regarded as an 8th wonder of the world. And I think the reason for that is that no one had conceived of the idea of using amber architecturally. I mean, the sheer audacity of taking something which we normally associate with ornamental jewellery and using it architecturally to effectively coat or laminate an entire room was foolish, incredible, folly.
In 1716, this extraordinary artifact was presented by the Germans to one of the most powerful emperors of Europe, Peter the Great of Russia. He took it to St. Petersburg, where it was installed in his summer palace on the city's outskirts. There it remained on display for over 150 years, until the summer of 1941. In June that year, Hitler invaded Russia. The German forces weren't just interested in seizing territory. In a meticulously planned operation, they took with them teams of art experts intent on seizing anything that represented German craftsmanship.
Hitler himself was a fanatically searching for German artists of the 19th century, 18th century artwork.
The Germans had a plan. This plan goes back many years prior to the invasion, when curators and cultural bureaucrats were sent out with travel guides. And they collated enormous lists of the treasures which would matter the most to the Third Reich.
High on their hit list was the Amber Room.
They figured that there was a tie-in on the Amber Room with the German heritage. They wanted the material back in Germany.
For Nazis, the Amber Room represents German power, a time machine that took them back to the idea of Teutonic Knights, these forebears of Nazism and National Socialism.
It was, in short, symbolic of a long history of German superiority and military might reaching back to the Middle Ages. As the Germans now swept through Russia, Soviet curators found themselves in a race against time. Thousands of precious artworks had to be packed up and shipped east as fast as possible to Siberia. But when they came to the Amber Room, they hit a problem. It seemed just too fragile to move.
When the curators attempted to remove the amber from the backing boards, they discovered it had become completely brittle.
It might have been possible to take it down without doing any damage, but it was a big risk.
So instead, they decided to disguise the room as another room. They got cigarette papers, which was pretty much all curators had in their pockets, and they stuck it over the amber. The idea being that the cigarette papers would act as a band-aid to stop the fragile amber cracking. On top of the cigarette papers, they put cotton wool, which actually they pulled from cushions. On top of that, they then put sheeting and then wallpaper.
It was the best they could do. By September 1941, 2 months after the invasion of Russia, the Germans had surrounded St. Petersburg. Here they headed for the Summer Palace and its Amber Room. Despite Russian attempts to hide it, German looters knew exactly where to look.
Consulting their ledgers and their plans, they have an idea of which room to go to, they have an idea of its dimensions, and they even bring packing cases and were far more organised than the Russians who were called upon to evacuate it.
The Germans shared none of the Russian fears about damaging it.
They ripped all that amber out, and I'm sure they numbered it properly, and put it in big chests and shipped it out.
Within days, the Amber Room was on its way from St. Petersburg to the German city of Königsberg, known today as Kaliningrad. Here it was installed in the city's castle museum. This would be the last known resting place of the Amber Room. What happened to it next would be murky and controversial. By the winter of 1944-1945, the Germans were in retreat. Allied planes bombed the German defences at Kaliningrad. The Red Army swept west. By April 1945, they'd retaken the city.
By the time the Red Army arrived, the city is on fire. Its people are cowed and living in terror. And every Red Army soldier who arrived at this locus for Nazism wanted to destroy a bit of it.
One of the first things the Russians did was search for the Amber Room. But as they scoured the city, it was nowhere to be found. What had happened? Had it been destroyed in the battle for the city? Had it been hidden somewhere? Or had the retreating Germans taken it with them? And if so, where? The mystery of the Amber Room had begun. Spring 1946, and the Soviet Union sent teams of art experts to comb the rubble of Europe for their country's looted treasures.
The Soviets had trophy brigades that went through and stripped every museum of every country they occupied.
One place they headed for was Kaliningrad, the last known resting place of the Amber Room. The mission was led by one of the country's leading art experts. Anatoly Kuchumov had been the chief curator of the Amber Room in the years before the war. In Kaliningrad, he soon found a highly significant clue. The Amber Room had contained 4 small stone mosaics. Sifting among the debris of the castle, he found fragments from 3 of them.
The 3, as it happened, were brittle, fire damaged, and when you touched them, they disintegrated. But the 4th was missing.
Kuchumov couldn't even find fragments from the 4th mosaic. It must have been removed. To Kuchumov, this was highly significant.
If one of these panels could be missing, what else from the room was missing? This is the logic of Kuchumov. If the panel had been taken, the far more valuable amber walls, the amber facings, must have been taken too. And in his opinion, there is a clear case to be made that the Amber Room survived the siege of Königsberg.
But if it had survived, where was it? Kuchumov's inquiries took him back to the closing days of the war. Reports suggested that as Allied bombs fell, the Amber Room was hidden below ground. Was this where he needed to look?
Kuchumov manages to get some digging equipment and a team of volunteers, and they begin their own excavation. He worked incredibly hard over a very short space of time. They had divers diving into booby-trapped and flooded tunnels, many of whom were died as the tunnels were electrified by the Nazis before they left and left with explosives in them.
The Russians even blasted their way through collapsed tunnels.
He broke through the foundations of various buildings to discover underground bunkers. He drained flooded cellars. He broke into stores in various castles that ringed the city.
But he could find nothing. The search for the Amber Room would become one of the great treasure hunts of the last half-century. One of the first countries to join the hunt was the newly formed Republic of East Germany, the GDR. This eastern part of Germany had been occupied by the Red Army in the closing months of the war and was now part of the Soviet Eastern Bloc. It would become a key defender of communism in Europe. And to make sure there was no internal opposition, the authorities created a highly efficient secret police, the so-called Stasi. The Stasi were housed in a large office block in Berlin. Here they gathered information on millions of East German citizens. In the late 1940s, as the Stasi got wind of the missing Amber Room, they embarked on their own search for it.
The GDR was very, very keen to look good in the eyes of Moscow. The communists in East Germany had a guilt complex about invading the first socialist country, the first communist country in the world, and many of them thought they should do something which would assuage that guilt. So therefore, when the Soviets wanted to find the Amber Room, it was natural for the GDR to say, yes, we will help you.
Yet the Stasi weren't the only secret police force looking for the Amber Room. In Moscow, the Russians turned for help to the KGB, based at the infamous Lubyanka. For the next 30 years, both the Russian and East German secret police would run separate searches for the Amber Room.
There's two secret investigations running in parallel, one being driven by the KGB and one being driven in East Germany by its fraternal compatriots of the Stasi.
But the search was neither very fraternal nor cooperative.
If the KGB thought that it was on the track of the Amber Room, it would not reveal that to the Stasi because they wanted the glory. And of course, the Stasi, they wanted to be the first to discover where the Amber Room was, because they wanted the glory. So therefore, you had this slightly strained relationship.
The KGB would concentrate its search at the last known home of the Amber Room, Kaliningrad, the former German city of Königsberg. Meanwhile, the Germans began their search closer to home. In Berlin, the Stasi's first clue came from a former Nazi officer. Gerhard Strauss had been an assistant curator at Kaliningrad Castle, where the Amber Room was on display. He explained that as Allied bombs fell and the Red Army edged ever closer to the city, he'd picked up rumors the Amber Room had been spirited to safety.
Strauss had got hold of various papers and talked to the curator of the Amber Room, and in his mind there had been several key locations for where the Amber Room may be, one of which was Görlitz.
Görlitz is a small German town which sits astride the German-Polish border. For a brief moment, it looked as though the Germans had made a breakthrough. But as they looked further at Strauss's evidence, it was clearly based on little more than hearsay. Not enough to turn a city upside down. What they needed was something much firmer. But with no more clues to go on, it was time to try something new. In 1958, the Stasi did something unprecedented in the tightly regimented society of East Germany. A regime notorious for its secrecy went public. In an article in the East German newspaper, Freie Welt, it made a public appeal for help.
An appeal goes out. There are clues that lie with ordinary everyday people, and that now is the time for those clues to be gathered together in order that the search can reach critical mass. If you know anything, contact your local city council, contact the newspapers, contact the KGB, contact the Stasi, contact whoever you want, but now you help us as loyal citizens to rejuvenate this search.
The German investigation was now led by a Stasi agent called Paul Enke.
Paul Enke was a Nazi, a member of the Hitler Youth, captured by the Soviets and shipped off for re-education. Re-education which he embraced wholeheartedly, and then as assuredly as he'd been a member of the Hitler Youth, he became a colonel in the Stasi, a fully paid up member of the secret police.
Within weeks of the article appearing, Enke received a letter. It came from a man with a remarkable story to tell. The man, known by the codename Rudi Ringel, told Enke he'd been digging through rubble in the basement of the family home. Here, he'd found his dead father's identity papers, together with a package of documents. Ringel had read them and been terrified. His father had been a member of the SS, Hitler's personal elite military force. In 1950s East Germany, such connections could mean serious trouble. The young Ringel had burnt the documents and tried to forget the whole incident. Now, 10 years later, the article in Freie Welt had reawoken the memory. Ringel told Enke the now destroyed documents had included a receipt confirming the handing over of 42 crates and an order to take them to a secret location. Most importantly, he remembered the transcript of a radio message.
Action amber room concluded. Storage in the SCH. Access blown up. Casualties through enemy action.
Enke could hardly believe his luck. Here was the first positive confirmation that somebody had ordered the evacuation of the Amber Room, and that the job had been completed. Enke now had solid evidence the Amber Room still existed. It had to be possible to find it. Digging further through Nazi files, Enke found documents suggesting the radio message had been sent from a small mining town in the Erzgebirge Mountains. The town was called Lengfeld. There were now 3 potential hiding places for the Amber Room. The Russians still believed it was hidden somewhere in Kaliningrad. German investigations had initially identified somewhere near the Polish border town of Görlitz. Now they suggested it might actually be near the German town of Lengfeld. But Lengfeld is surrounded by hills and valleys. There were hundreds of potential hiding places. The evidence was much too vague. Enke needed something more concrete. Then, in the 1960s, there appeared to be another breakthrough. It came from the parallel investigation in Russia. For some time, the KGB had been interrogating a man called Erich Koch. Koch had been an important Nazi official. Throughout the war, he'd been the Gauleiter, or boss, of Kaliningrad. He'd been the man responsible for installing the Amber Room in the Castle Museum. Now, in 1967, he finally admitted to the Russian KGB that during the closing days of the war, he'd ordered it taken down.
He at last concedes that the Amber Room was part of a list of treasures that was to be packed up and evacuated. And in fact, because the evacuation couldn't succeed, he claims instead it was placed in crates and buried in a secret bunker beneath a church in Kaliningrad.
Here was new, hard evidence to back up the Russian curator Anatoly Kuchemov's theory that the Amber Room was not in the German Erzgebirge. It was still in Kaliningrad.
This evidence is leapt upon by the Soviets, who immediately requisitioned heavy digging equipment and volunteers, and they set out to turn the entire city upside down again.
Once again, the Russians scoured Kaliningrad. But once again, they found nothing. If the Amber Room really was in the city, its hiding place remained a mystery. Meanwhile, back in East Germany, Paul Enke was still trying to firm up the evidence he had gathered. For 8 years, he'd drawn a blank. Then, in 1976, in the city of Weimar, Enke found records of Koch's personal hoard of looted art. Koch had been a major looter of Soviet artworks. The record suggested the hoard included 132 silver candelabra. The number was highly significant. It was exactly the same number of candelabra as had been in the Amber Room. Were they one and the same? Enke interviewed local people in Weimar. He gradually uncovered a new trail that suggested Koch had been lying to the KGB.
One of the compelling stories that he reports on is an ambulance in which crates were loaded and that certain unknown but mysterious and incredibly valuable treasures under the auspices of the Red Cross, i.e. a neutral vehicle, a vehicle that wouldn't be attacked either by air or on the ground, fled Weimar carrying these treasures.
The record showed they had taken the treasure south to the Erzgebirge Mountains. If Enke was right, the Amber Room wasn't in Kaliningrad at all. The bits of the jigsaw were coming together. Rudi Ringel's evidence had also pointed to the Erzgebirge. Enke was now convinced he finally knew just where to look for the Amber Room. That year, Enke started searching disused mines in the region.
They begin zeroing in on a series of mines, and they've brought in heavy digging equipment. And they dig, and they spend considerable amounts of money on this operation. It's a vast operation involving huge numbers of volunteers.
Encke narrowed the search to one mine, but the shaft was blocked by rock falls. The Germans dug hard. They blasted through blockages. But Encke was in for a nasty surprise.
When they break through eventually to the areas they had mapped out as the key locations, what they discover rather than treasure is rolled up and burnt pieces of Pravda.
Pravda was the Russian Communist Party newspaper. The burnt pages were dated July 1945. They'd been used by the Red Army to roll cigarettes. The Soviet forces had already explored the mine 31 years earlier, and they'd clearly not found the Amber Room. But nobody had bothered to tell Encke or his German colleagues. The operation had cost the Stasi some $500,000. It had been an expensive and embarrassing failure. Back at headquarters, Encke's bosses ordered an investigation into what had gone wrong. The Stasi were not used to failure. They also made a second alarming discovery. Rudi Ringel's story that his father had been a major in the SS was a complete fabrication.
The man that Paul Encke had built his entire case on was in fact a wounded postman who had no connection to the Amber Room story, a fantasist with forged documents. The German connection to the Amber Room was fallacious and a fantasy.
Yet incredibly, despite even this setback, the Stasi spent the next 10 years continuing to look for the Amber Room.
Once the Stasi had started on the operation, they didn't give up. There was no concept of cost effectiveness. It was the objective which was important. And therefore, they would spend more and more money and more time, even though the end result may have been very, very meager, even though the chances of finding the Amber Room were very, very small. That didn't matter. In a communist system, you just kept on looking.
In fact, the search would only end when something much bigger changed the entire world. In 1989, the wall dividing East and West Germany came down. Communism in Eastern Europe collapsed. East and West Germany were reunited. In the following euphoria, a German energy company agreed to sponsor the construction of a brand new Amber Room and give it to the Russians. It would be a massive undertaking. For a start, the art of amber carving had been virtually lost.
They had craftsmen, but not the craftsmen that they'd had in times past. People hadn't been carving amber in that way for so long.
The workmen had almost nothing to go on.
They didn't know exactly how the room had been made. They had no colour photographs of it. They had to work out how thick the mosaics were. They had to work out how big the carvings were. They tried making panels and discarded them. Some of them they decided were simply wrong. And of course the big problem was the colour.
This was a problem nobody had anticipated.
New amber tends to be sort of bright. If they just put Baltic amber, untreated, on the walls, the whole room would have looked lemon yellow. It would have been completely wrong. So they took one or two of the old caskets that they had from that time that would have aged in the same way, and they photographed them in black and white. Then they compared those black and white photographs with the black and white photographs they already had of the old amber room, and from that they worked out this grey is that tone on the casket, so a matching one would be that on the wall. And that's how they reconstructed it. Whether or not it's completely correct, of course, we don't know.
The work took several years. Finally, in 2002, amongst much pomp and circumstance, it was erected at its former home in the Summer Palace outside St. Petersburg. It may not have been the original, but it was still a spectacular sight. But despite this success, it left a big outstanding question. What had happened to the original Amber Room? In 2004, Adrian Levy was one of 2 investigative journalists to publish the results of a 4-year trawl through reports, letters, and documents in Berlin, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. The investigation had taken him back to 1945 and the months just after the war. Here, he'd found a new clue. That summer, the Russians had dispatched a high-powered art expert to Königsberg to look for the Amber Room. Yet the visit had gone almost unrecorded. His name was Alexander Brushov, a professor at the State Historical Museum in Moscow.
What staggered Brushov when he turned up in Königsberg was that there had been no attempt to secure the ruins of Königsberg Castle, to ring it, place a perimeter around it, to protect treasures that were being stored in it.
Slowly, Brushov had pieced together a chronology of events.
Up until the surrender of Königsberg, the castle was intact. And yet, between the surrender in mid-April, the occupation by the end of May, when he arrives, the castle was torched.
The big question was, had the Amber Room gone up with the castle? And if so, who had been responsible? Brushov reached an uncomfortable conclusion.
He noted on his report and in his private diary that the torching was the responsibility of the Red Army, who saw the castle as the epitome of Nazism, of everything that they despised, without thinking of what might be stored in the cellars. One item of which was the most precious treasure of all, the Amber Room.
So the Russians themselves had destroyed the Amber Room. It had been a spectacular and embarrassing own goal. Brushov had solved the mystery in 1945. So why had the truth been kept a secret? Why had the Russians claimed it still existed? For Levy, the answer was simple. The thought that the Red Army had carelessly destroyed one of the country's most important artworks was not a notion the Soviet authorities could accept. So instead, they'd fabricated a new truth. The myth that the Amber Room had been saved but hidden was born. Moreover, Levy discovered that in sending Anatoly Kuchumov to Kaliningrad, the Russians had found just the man to spin the yarn. Ever since the German invasion, Kuchumov had been a troubled man. In 1941, he'd been personally responsible for the artworks at the Summer Palace, including the Amber Room. It was he who decided it was too brittle to move. It had been his decision to leave it where it was and paper over it. But the Germans had shown that he was completely wrong and had carried it away in a matter of days.
Anatoly Kuchumov came back after the war, racked by this decision, racked by guilt. So here we have a young curator, an ambitious young man who's made a fateful decision that turned out to be the wrong decision. He didn't pack the Amber Room, but the Nazis stripped it in 36 hours.
In the post-war political climate, responsibility for such a disaster could mean arrest and even death.
He's come back into a heavily politicised environment at the beginnings of a Cold War, where the KGB dominate and guilt is being apportioned. Other colleagues are disappearing as a result of those decisions. Is the man who is responsible for the vanishing of the Amber Room going to come back saying he found nothing? That's not going to happen.
So instead, Kuchumov had come up with a new answer, one more favourable to Russia and himself. It had probably saved his life.
Kuchumov's verdict, when he was sent there in 1946, was there was enough evidence to suggest the Amber Room survived, which meant that he could also therefore provide the evidence that he himself was not guilty of anything, no crime had been committed. The Amber Room had not been lost.
Levy had finally got to the bottom of the mystery. The search for the Amber Room had gone nowhere because it had been destroyed. But that hasn't stopped some people continuing to look for it. In the early 2000s, treasure hunter Helmut Gensel led a search for the Amber Room in the Czech Republic, close to the German border. He claimed to have picked up rumors that heavy lorries had transported the Amber Room to a disused silver mine as the war was ending.
Why, at the last days of the war, all these trucks would come here? There must be a reason.
Meanwhile, across the border in Germany, where the mine has a second entrance, the local mayor also began digging.
The measuring instruments showed some hollow space and metal objects. We want to check it now by drilling.
Neither hunt has ever found anything. But one man is still hopeful. Deep in the Ore Mountains, Henry Hattenhauer is still chasing his dream of discovering the Amber Room. He's found a mine he believes may contain important new evidence.
We found footprints from SS boots, a lot of footprints, all pointing to this one place in the mine. We found a lampshade with 5 light bulbs, which is very unusual.
Electrical fittings are never found in these mines. They were closed in the 19th century, before the use of electric lighting. To Hattenhauer, it suggests the mine has been used much more recently.
It was definitely not just used as an ordinary mine. Personally, I'm convinced that the Amber Room is here. I'm absolutely convinced. I mean, I know that there are many people claiming to know where the Amber Room is, and People laugh about it. But we really have a lot of interesting hints that make us think that the Amber Room is here.
Just beyond the footprints and the mysterious lights, the mine shaft is blocked by a rockfall. It would cost thousands of pounds to clear it, money Hattenhauer and his group don't have.
We are very close of finding the Amber Room, but we just need help. We can't do it ourselves.
So far, Hattenhauer has failed to find a backer. But he's not giving up hope. Such is the value and mythic status of the Amber Room, it will continue to exert a magnetic pull over treasure hunters. Even though all the evidence suggests it was destroyed more than 60 years ago.